Tonight, connect with Jeff Amestoy, a former Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. If you could describe his life in a word, many would say bold. From that landmark ruling that led to civil unions to a new book about slavery, how he shaped Vermont and Vermont shaped him. Well, Jeff Amestoy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So let's just start in the beginning.
Yep.
You were born in Rutland.
Right.
What was it like growing up in Rutland?
Well, first, it was a while back. I grew up in Rutland in the 1950s. You know, people get nostalgic about the old Vermont, but you know, it wasn't all that great in the 1950s in Vermont. And Rutland, economically, a tough time. I think a tough time for my parents. On the other hand, you know, it's great being from Rutland. Played a lot of ball in Rutland. Lived there until we moved to Connecticut when I was 14. But you know, certainly, I think Rutland shaped me. Still have a lot of friends down there. And you know, when I first started, I clerked for Jim Jeffords, who was from Rutland, and Robert Stafford. You know, there's some really great leaders that came out of Rutland, Vermont, and great judges, Judge McCaffrey. So very much a shaping part of who I am. I think when Jim Jeffords switched to left the Republican Party, and I was giving my political theory as to why he had done that, someone said to me, "No, it's because he's from Rutland and you can't push Rutland guys around." So I don't know if that was true or not, but I think there's a touch of that. So I think Rutland is, you know, certainly part of me, and still have some great friends there.
So as you said, you left, went to school, but you came back and you
Right.
decided to raise your family here, and
Right.
you have 3 daughters. What brought you back to Vermont?
Well, I think just if you're a native Vermonter, I think you know, part of it just stays with you. I came back because I thought it was a place where I might be able to make a difference, and of course had family here, and so it seemed like a good place to start my legal career.
So you started your legal career, and then it kind of took a little bit of a different path because you decided to run for elected office. What prompted you to make the decision that you wanted to run for Attorney General? You served there for 12 years. Right. What launched you from this path to a fork in the road?
Well, I became an assistant attorney general, and being at a relatively young age, and I have a daughter who's now an assistant attorney general at about the same age, and when you're in your 20s, you begin to think you can do things better than anyone else, and I decided that I could probably run the office of attorney general as well as anybody else. Certainly a premature judgment, but and politics didn't look that hard to me. Also a premature judgment, I think. And so it really was born by the fact that I thought, you know, I had something in terms of what I wanted to do as Attorney General. So it really wasn't that I was interested in politics. And in fact, when I got into it, I got maybe a little less interested in it because it was much harder than I thought it would be. But it certainly got the vote of confidence from Vermonters. And then, you know, really there's no, in terms of a law firm in Vermont, there's no better law firm to be part of than the Attorney General's office. It's a great office, so you know, I really loved it there.
So Vermonters did elect you, and I want to take everyone back to 1984. This is a report that was on WCAX. It's going to take you back a little bit from election night when you had found out that you had indeed won.
In the race for Attorney General, Republican Jeffrey Amestoy has 105,000 votes, easily outpacing the Democrat Bruce Lawler. We have 2 reports from Montpelier.
Republican Jeffrey Amestoy and his staff are now sure that they have this election won.
I think that the way he ran his campaign, particularly in the last 3 weeks, said something about the type of Attorney General he would have made, and I think that was reflected in the vote tonight. So I do think the tactics of his campaign had some impact on the vote.
So you did go on to win. I understand it was very late when you finally got the call. There's reporters interviewing you, and there is the moment where you did learn that indeed your opponent had conceded. What was that like for you?
Well, it was a difficult campaign. Of course, when you're in it, you know, you have a very low opinion of your opponent. I mellowed a little bit over the years, but Bruce Lawler, who went on to a very distinguished career in the military, was a very tough opponent. So when he finally conceded, I remember him saying to me, I've just come in second place in an axe fight, and that's sort of how it felt to me too. So, but as I said, very challenging. Learned a fair amount, I think, but I do think Vermonters. I think it's still true today. Vermonters let you be who you are, and they make up their mind on the basis of those who try to be as true as they can to be themselves.
So then you get to be sworn in, and this is, of course, a ceremonial event that happens before your family and all people in the legislature. This was, again, you got sworn in then in 1995. What was that moment like for you, taking the oath of office, knowing that you had now become elected to do work for Vermonters?
Let's see, are we talking about the oath of office for Attorney General or Chief Justice?
Attorney General now. You're jumping ahead. We'll get there.
Well, again, I think that was a wonderful experience because that was 1985 was also the year that Madeline Kuhn became the first female governor. So it was really her day, but a tremendous day for me as well in my family. And of course, I was looking forward to getting to work as Attorney General, and we had some challenges immediately in terms of some questions about the Vermont judiciary, as a matter of fact. So we got to work. I had some great people around me, and really for the next 12 years, I don't think there was a day where I didn't really appreciate the fact that I was part of that law firm.
So you had 12 years there. Then you find out, I'm sure, that your name is in the ring to be part of the Vermont Supreme Court.
Right.
Now, I've heard people describe to me that sometimes being on the Vermont Supreme Court can be isolating. What made you want to go for that?
Well, I wanted to be able. I think probably the two best jobs one could have in the state of Vermont as a lawyer, or Attorney General and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Sort of the context of that decision of that selection was a bit complicated because the governor had a list and didn't like who was on the list, and they reopened the search, and I got a call saying that perhaps I ought to apply, and so I decided to apply, but I'd just been elected as Attorney General for the 7th term, and I remember driving my application down to southern part of the state on Christmas Eve, as a matter of fact, in order to get there in time to be considered. But I wanted an opportunity to shape the law, and I wanted a bit of a respite from campaigning and from the very public life of being Attorney General. So it was a transition that I thought made sense in terms of my career and my family.
Yeah, talk about your family. So at this point, you got the 3 girls at this point.
Right.
How was that work-life balance between what happened at the Supreme Court and your family life?
Easier to balance things, I think, when one's on the court, at least on the Supreme Court. I'm sure the trial judges of Vermont would say they have more difficulties balancing it because the caseload for the trial judges of Vermont is so difficult. But it was the transition in terms of family, I think, was easier than from the years in which when I was Attorney General, where although I didn't have contested elections every time, the demands there were a little harder on the family, and plus the girls were a little bit older, so from that standpoint, I think it was a nice balance.
So at your swearing-in ceremony, when you became part of the Vermont Supreme Court and you became the Chief Justice, what were your expectations of what it would be like, and what was it actually like?
Well, I think I described myself as a rookie Chief Justice, which is an accurate description. So there's a transition period. Someone said to me, it'll probably be 3 or 4 years before you start to begin to feel comfortable at all, and I think that's probably about right. My colleagues were welcoming, but it's a different context and different atmosphere than being Attorney General. I had a friend of mine say, well, the good news is the phone doesn't ring, and the bad news is the phone doesn't ring, and I thought that sort of much captured at least the difference in the kind of day-to-day responsibilities. But of course, there's a great time for reflection and being able to devote oneself more purely to legal questions than the political aspect of it.
So one of the biggest decisions, of course, was the unanimous decision, Baker versus State in 1999. Take us back to that time, and that was the landmark ruling that allowed for the legislature to then enact what it did with civil unions. What was that time like?
Well, certainly doesn't seem that long ago to me in terms of it's 15, 16 years ago now, and particularly when one looks at the trajectory of same-sex marriage over the last 16 years, it's really quite incredible. I don't think, I'm sure, from the litigants to the plaintiffs in the case to the court itself to the legislature, very few people could have projected that in 2015 the United States Supreme Court was going to reach the kind of decision that Vermont reached 16 years ago. I think at the time one has to remember that that issue of same-sex marriage was a very, very difficult one for the country, in which other courts in Alaska and Hawaii attempted to address it and immediately received a tremendous amount of pushback. And so at that point in time, I think it was extraordinarily difficult case. And of course, the lawyers, Beth Robinson, who's now on the Supreme Court, Vermont Supreme Court, and Susan Murray, and the Vermont Freedom to Marry Task Force had spent really years leading up to that point in time, so they could make an argument in a context in which they hoped that whatever the decision of the court was, that people would be able to discuss the issue in a constructive manner. And I think ultimately that's what Vermonters did.
In making that ruling, you wrote something that has been often repeated and noted, but you said that couples were just seeking a lasting human relationship. And you said that quest is simply, when all is said and done, a recognition of our common humanity.
Well, I tried to, again, it was a unanimous court. There were 5 of us there, so I don't want to make it sound like it was just me. But in writing that opinion, I thought one issue that was important, or one aspect of it was important, was that one knew it was going to be a decision that was controversial and in which there would be a fair amount of pushback and discussion. And one hoped that the discussion was going to be in constructive terms and not as much in legal terms. And so the phrase, I'd hoped that as part of the discussion, Vermonters would think about the humanity of the aspect of that. And I really think was one of the instructive pieces of the follow-up, both in the legislature and later, that Vermonters really, I think, helped to lead the nation in a considered discussion of an issue of homosexuality and marriage equality that had really had not taken place in the country at all. So I think from that standpoint, Vermonters I think they did themselves proud.
You said earlier that you're raised in Rutland, and sort of the mentality of you can't push Rutland folks around. Yeah. When you're in the public spotlight like that, and it was such an intense time, how did you handle that?
Well, I think it became an intense time for a lot of folks later on, particularly the legislators. So I mean, we received some mail. I mean, I received some mail that was opinions were pungently expressed about the opinion.
And I'm guessing not all in favor, based on that little twinkle in your eye.
So and I think there were a lot of folks who arrived from the outside who were pretty hostile, and I think that was more difficult for the legislature than it was for me and for members of the court. But there's no question that we had heightened security and all the kinds of things that one has to think about in terms of a controversial decision, which again, looking from the Supreme Court's decision today, back 15 or 16 years ago, where now civil unions is seen as an extraordinarily cautious and conservative step, it didn't seem that way at the time.
So when you saw the national news come out, I'm sure you watched it like most people did. When the U.S. Supreme Court decided marriage equality for all, it was different. You, at the time, didn't decide, and the court didn't decide. You put it to the legislature to decide. This was a judicial matter. The U.S. Supreme Court decided. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I think it was a wonderful decision, of course, and like other members of observers of the court, it was all came down to Justice Kennedy and as a deciding vote. And so, of course, not only did he cast a deciding vote for marriage equality, but he also wrote a wonderful opinion, which I think echoed some of the themes that came out of the Vermont opinion. So, it really was an extraordinary day. Much more extraordinary, obviously, for folks who have been for years in difficult circumstances in terms of discrimination. But I think, looking back to where that issue started in Vermont to what happened just last week, I think is again a tribute to Vermonters and the community dialogue that followed our decision.
So you spent 7 years on the Vermont Supreme Court.
Right.
What made you say, okay, you know what, I'm done. Time to hang up the robe.
I've been working 30 years for the state of Vermont. So as I said, I had the two best jobs in Vermont for a lawyer, Attorney General and Chief Justice, but I think I just got to the point where I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different, something outside the law, and I had the opportunity to go to the Harvard's Kennedy School, and so I decided I would take that opportunity.
So in 2004, you say, okay, I'm done.
Right.
And at the time, this is what Jeff Amestoy said about how he wanted to be remembered.
Well, I think the most important question is, did I contribute to the public's faith in the judicial system? I mean, when I came in, that was the question that I said I thought I should be judged by. It's still the question I think I should be judged by, and it's for others to answer that. But I think the most significant contribution a judicial officer can make is to instill and keep the public's faith in justice and in the judiciary, and I'll let others judge whether or not I've made that contribution.
So judging the judge, that was back in 2004 when you said that. 2015, you've had the gift of some time and some space. What do you think back on your time there, and how would you want to be remembered? Are you going to give me the same answer?
Yes, I am. I am going to give you the same answer. So I do think there's as I'm sure my wife Susan could tell you, there's a danger in evaluating yourself, and I think I would leave it at that. But I do think, and I think it gives me an opportunity to say something about the Vermont judiciary, and I do think a number of folks I worked with in the Attorney General's office became judges. They're now reaching the point where they've served 30 years, all very honorably. I think Vermont's blessed with the kind of integrity and hard work and quality of judges in the trial and the Supreme Court. And I think one of the reasons Vermonters have and should have faith in their system in Vermont, judiciary system in Vermont, is because of that.
So then you went to the Harvard Business School, and you just
Institute of Politics.
Institute of Politics.
I would have been a
Yep,
disaster. I'd be a disaster at the business school. Trust me.
Yeah, Institute of Politics, and then you've come out with a new book that is going to be out, and it's called Slavish Shore: The Odyssey of Richard Henry Dana Jr., who I've now learned a lot about that I did not know a lot about. Talk to me about who he was and why you thought this was the book you wanted to work a few years on.
Well, you're not alone in finding the subject somewhat obscure, but in fact, probably older viewers would be more familiar with Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, which he wrote about his journey around Cape Horn to California in 1835, 1836. He came back, wrote that book, and opened his law office in Boston when he was 25 years old. 2 Years Before the Mast is a classic of American literature, I think. World literature, really. It's been in print for 175 years as of September 1st of this year. And in fact, Dana's bicentennial birth, 200 years, was August 1st, actually the date of the publication of the book. I got interested in Dana because when he came back, although he was part of an old established Boston family, one of the best, so-called best people, he could have given, he could have followed a path that would have made him a senator and made him a lot of money and everything. And yet, instead of doing that, he defended first sailors that were badly treated, and then fugitive slaves in Boston, at a time when Boston's best people were really a pro-slavery community. Really, when you look back at that history, you think Boston is in the forefront of abolitionists and all the rest. But in fact, there were certainly currents of that. For Dana to defend fugitive slaves at that time was extraordinarily courageous. So that piqued my interest, and then he had an amazing career as he went forward from that. So I've tried to write that narrative in a way that I hope is engaging and instructive.
He did a lot more. Like you said, he started out defending slaves, but he ended up even prosecuting the Confederate president.
That's right. Yes, he was. He was involved in probably the three extraordinary cases in the 19th century. the defense of Anthony Burns, who was the last person from Massachusetts sent back into slavery. That was a case that really did a lot towards prompting the division between North and South. And then in 1862, he argued the prize cases, and those were the cases that made clear Lincoln had the war authority to carry on the Civil War. Had Dana not argued that case, it's likely the Supreme Court, the Civil War would have ended up in some kind of a compromise. So that was a hugely important case. Then he was the special prosecutor trying Jefferson Davis for treason, although he did not think that case should be brought, and eventually was instrumental in persuading Andrew Johnson that the case should be dropped because at that point in time it served really no purpose. So he had an extraordinary legal career. The other aspect, I think, was just to me, and I hope to readers, it's just interesting to follow someone who was torn between his duties at home and his duties to his family and to Boston and to the law, and his interest as a sailor and someone who had been to California. He was always, I think, torn between romance and convention, and so there's a fair amount of that in the book as well.
I was going to say that sounds like it could ring true today for anybody, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So why do you think Vermonters should take a look at this book? What do you hope they can learn from it?
Well, I think it's a human story, right? So, and I think you're exactly right that "slavish shore" is a phrase from Melville's Moby Dick, and it just speaks to, I think, the human condition. I think everyone at some point has some tension between responsibility and independence, responsibility and freedom, romance and convention. And Dana really lived that to an extraordinary extent. I mean, he was in California at a time when there was literally only one building in San Francisco. He returns 30 years later, and it's now a major city. And so throughout his life, I think he just demonstrates this contrast and individual tension between independence and duty and responsibility. And of course, in taking on Daniel Webster and all the powers that be, he didn't know what the end story was going to be. So I think there's a fair amount of courage in there, and he inspired me, and if I've written the book correctly, he may inspire some others too.
So have you had that moment that he had? You talk about sort of that tension.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think someone said all biography is autobiography, and I don't know if that's true or not, but there are certainly times. I mean, Dana was a far greater lawyer and contributor than I ever would be, but I certainly could recognize in his life the kinds of tensions he was under, and I think the fact that I'd been involved in politics and been a judge gave me some feeling for some of the pressures he certainly had to live under, and then I certainly identified with the human condition when he had the difficulties of trying to do what was right and to leave,
So you live in Waterbury now.
Right, Waterbury Center.
Waterbury Center.
Right.
I know you're going to be heading out on a book tour to talk about this new
Right.
book. How do you think Vermont has changed since when you were growing up in Rutland to now?
Well, I think Vermont has continued to evolve it always has been, I think, a state in which we recognize and care for our neighbors, but allow some independence and privacy. I think Vermont, again, to go back to your opening question, those who remember Vermont in the 1950s, when it was a very, very difficult place to live for many people. I mean, it still is, but I think on balance, Vermont's sense of independence, its inclusion, demonstrated in the way it responded to the marriage equality arguments, I think all have been true to those who founded Vermont. They always thought of it as a special place, and I do, and I think most Vermonters do.
So what do you think is next? You got the book. I know that's been a labor of love for a couple years. You're going to talk about that, but what do you think is your next chapter?
I'm going to get the Red Sox home for another World Series here. That's good.
Yes, we should talk about that. So you are an avid Red Sox fan.
Right, and I'll just point out that when I left the court to go to the Kennedy School at Harvard, that was 2004, and they won the World Series as soon as I arrived. So.
Look at that picture, right? Is that that's one of the...
Yes,
there you are.
Right. Taking the girls there my youngest Nancy, we had seats in right field, and those who know Fenway Park know that that angle is not the greatest angle to see home plate. About the 5th inning, she said to me, "Oh, the pitcher's over there." You know, she was looking at the left fielder the entire time. So I don't think that didn't make her a baseball fan, but my middle daughter Christina is a great fan. So.
Yeah, what has it meant to sort of impart, you know, you love of baseball to them, but everything else as well?
Well, of course, I'm, you know, like most parents, I'm very proud of my daughters, and as I mentioned, Katie's an assistant attorney general. Bill Sorrell gave me the great privilege of swearing in Katie last September, so that in front of an office in which many people that I'd worked with are still there. So that was quite a thrill. And Christina and Nancy, both working in Washington D.C., and very interested in politics and in literature and in baseball. So it's all good.
Go Red Sox, right?
Right.
Well, Jeff Amestoy, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
And also, thank you at home for watching. We want to connect with you and keep the conversation going. You can always reach out with feedback and ideas at connect@vermontpbs.org and get caught up on episodes and extra material at vermontpbs.org. Until next time, we'll see you then.